So glad 3 sunny days in a row cured my depression forever. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. Today, I want to talk about how I decided monthly reading wrap-ups were way too much for me, and that I would divide the year into 4 seasonal wrap-ups instead. So this one actually is going to include... What is it going to include? Let me look it up. This one actually is going to include a 4th month, because I stopped making these after my October reading wrap-up, so this one's going to cover November, December, January, and February. But normally I'm looking to divide the year into 4 sections of 3 months each. Anyway, I'm going to call this my first winter reading wrap-up. Okay, so I read like 42 books during this time period, so I am going to set a few ground rules about what's going to be in the wrap-up and what's not. If I read a book for a different special video project, for example, the books that I read for my Hawaii video, or books I'm reading for an upcoming project that I don't want to say too much about, but it's about Baba Yaga, then in those cases, I'm leaving those out of the wrap-up because I'm going to talk about them elsewhere. And this is already going to be way too long. I'm also going to leave out books I read from the middle of manga series. I read a lot of those, and it's kind of weird to just like summarize volume 5. So unless I'm starting a new series, I'm finishing a series, or something really noteworthy happens, I'm gonna leave the manga I read out, except for standalones, which I'll talk about. I still haven't quite figured out a reliable way to organize these, so this time I think I'm going to try doing it roughly chronologically, starting with what I read first, and ending with what I read most recently. Not including what I've read so far this month, because the first version of this video I filmed got erased, and it's pretty far into March now, but we're going to ignore that. First on the list is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by W.S. Merwin, my favorite American poet laureate. This is a medieval epic poem. Considering the A24 movie The Green Knight just came out, it's been getting a lot of attention recently. At a book sale this summer, I found this version translated by Merwin, who is one of my favorite working poets, and so I had to pick it up. It's the side-by-side edition with the Middle English and the translation. This is pretty early Middle English, so it would be tough to read just straight without translation, unless you're a medievalist, because Middle English this early has a lot in common with Old English, which is technically a different language from what we speak. I did take a class on this era of Middle English, but most of that's flown out of my head by now, so... Anyway, I greatly enjoyed the translation. Merwin is a very talented poet, and I also enjoyed being able to glance at the original and see what I could glean from it. This was a really fun read. This is a weird story. It's sort of a Christmas ghost story meets an Arthurian romance. You've got to experience the sort of folkloric weirdness for yourself, I think. It doesn't have a ton in common with the A24 movie that just came out. I did enjoy that movie for its own sake, but I thought the ending of the original was much stronger. The A24 movie cuts off at what I think is thematically just the wrong moment, although I'm sure they felt very edgy about it. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that at the moment. I read The Tea Dragon Tapestry, which is the 3rd in the Tea Dragon Society trilogy, which I cannot hold up to the camera because the little girl who lives next door is borrowing it, but that's the first book, and that is a tea dragon. They're little cat-sized dragons that grow magic tea leaves out of their heads. This is a diverse, queer normative, cottagecore fantasy series for children. I mean, what more can I say? It's perfect. These books are delightful, they're huge comfort reads, and if you haven't read them yet, pick up a cup of tea and curl up with one, and if you have read them, do that anyway. They're worth every reread. Next, I read Walk Among Us, which is a set of 3 novellas set in the world of the RPG Vampire the Masquerade, which is basically Vampire D&D. These were fun. I didn't think any of them was particularly strong or earth-shattering, but I love a good vampire story, and each one of these is a pretty good vampire story, so if you're a sucker for vampires, this will be fun. If you're not, skip it. Cassandra Khaw wrote the middle story, and she is the author of Nothing But Blackened Teeth, which I had just read when I picked this up, so that was a lot of fun for me. Nothing But Blackened Teeth is better than her novella that's in here. Obviously, these are going to be kind of middle of the road, so if it's your stuff, read it. If it's not your stuff, it's not your stuff. Fun one, though. I read Caraval, which I also can't show you because one of the children next door also has it. And I read this because a teenage coworker of mine at the bookstore is extremely enthused about it and wanted me to read it. So I did, and I thought it was fine. The world building's kind of interesting. The characters are fine. They're distinct from one another. The plot moves at a good clip. I feel like I would have loved this if I picked it up as a teenager, but this is one of those YA books that's so YA that I think it just... I don't often read a book and think I'm too old for this, but I'm too old for this. It's not really a criticism of the book, though. I think it's really good at what it's there to do. My next read is one I really liked, and that's The Route of Ice and Salt by Jose Luis Zarate, a Mexican queer horror writer. And it is set on Dracula's voyage to England and is narrated by the captain of that ship, who is dealing with a traumatic past and being a closeted gay man and a ton of internalized homophobia, and also a vampire killing all his men and eventually him. It's very poetically written, it's beautiful, it's very sad, it's atmospheric, very cold and damp and furtive and grimy. As far as I can tell, the translation is lovely. I am trying to get back into being able to read Spanish, so I think this is the only one of his novels so far that's translated into English, so I would eventually like to read it in the original and read some of his other work as well. This was super worth reading. Adaptations of Dracula usually are, honestly, but this was something special. It's something that you should pick up if you possibly can. This past summer, I was visiting some very, very conservative and very, very unpleasant relatives, and I rage subscribed to the Leftist Press Verso's monthly book club. One of the books that I got for that was A World Without Police by Geomar, and I read it, so it's in this wrap-up. Pretty good. Summarizes the problems with policing and some of the alternatives that have been tried out in different societies. Kind of a way to open up your imagination for different ways of living, which is one of my favorite types of nonfiction. Pretty good read. You know, you'll probably encounter some stuff you already knew if you're at the point where you're picking this up, but I definitely learned some stuff I didn't know. Pretty decent. Okay. These books. A Deadly Education and The Last Graduate by Naomi Novik. I picked this up to read on the plane to Hawaii, and then I started reading it and couldn't finish it, or couldn't put it down until I'd finished it. Read it overnight, went back to the bookstore, and picked up the sequel to read on the plane instead. They're thrilling. Sort of genre subverting fantasy stories, with a little bit of a dark academia tinge, but it's not really the same vibe to me. I mean, these get put in displays of those a lot, but I don't think that's quite right. But they're about a school for magical teenagers where magic users attract demons and monsters when they use magic, and due to the nature of puberty or something, teenagers, adolescents are the worst for this. So the school is cut off from the rest of the world. There are no adults there. It basically runs itself, and it's infested with monsters. And all magical teenagers have to go there because it's too dangerous for them to stay in the regular world. They'll put other people at risk. So it takes Survive High School to the extreme. It's a lot of fun. If you like fantasy, you will delight in these stories. Even if you're not that into fantasy, though, I think there's something for you in these. I recommend them to people who aren't super genre savvy as well, because I think there's a certain amount of diffidence that really makes the non-fantasy reader, that really gives them an entryway into the story. The Last Graduate does end on a cliffhanger. The third book is supposed to come out later this year, so I would recommend waiting to pick these up until the third book is out so you don't have to suffer like I am. This was a delightful vacation read. The Girl from the Sea by Molly Knox Ostertag, author of the Witch Boy series, which I've talked about before. I love them. I think they use they, them pronouns. I apologize if I got that wrong, but I'm not going to stop filming to look it up. Yeah, so this is a Selkie story. It's a lesbian girl who falls in love with a Selkie. It's really cute. There's a certain element of the grumpy sunshine trope. Although the grumpy character isn't really grumpy, she's just a little sad. It's Selkies. It's the summer teen love story, but one of them's a Selkie. Did I mention it's Selkies? It's really good. You should read this. It's good. Here's another vacation read, and I'm just going to break the trend and talk about the other two books in the series that I read later on, because that makes the most sense. I read #Murder Trending by Gretchen McNeil. This book was so much fun. It's a campy young adult slasher. There's supposed to be an element of social commentary, but it is not what you would read the book for. You would read the book for the campy slasher fun. The premise is that when a criminal is sentenced to death, they are put on an island called Alcatraz 2.0, which is monitored by cameras at all times and broadcast on an app as a reality show where they're hunted down by creative, flamboyant serial killers. Obviously, the main character is innocent and finds out that most of the other characters have also been put on the island on trumped-up charges, and it's, they have to survive, they have to plot to escape and expose the corruption, and it's good fun. There's a sequel, Murder Funding. After Alcatraz 2.0 is busted, they put out an audition call for a TV show based on the same premise, only this time the murders will be fake. 3 guesses how that goes. Also fun. Maybe not quite as great as Murder Trending, but the main character is a lesbian, so that kind of made me like it more, because I am a simple person. And the prequel, #No Escape, which is about a deadly escape room. Also great. Just good fun. I liked these all a lot, and I will read future books by this author because I had a great time, and that's all I wanted out of them, and that's what I got. Can't hold this one up because my friend is borrowing it, but it's Deserter, the latest release of Junji Ito's work in English. Uh, Book of short stories. They're all pretty solid. It's probably not my favorite storybook of his, but the final story, Deserter, is a really fascinating one that really, I think, portrays some Japanese post war anxieties in really interesting ways. Definitely worth a read for any fan of his work. I thought it was a really strong story. That's all I really have to say about that. We all like him here. You know, you're probably going to read it anyway. Okay, here's a young adult read that I absolutely loved. In the Ravenous Dark by A.M. Strickland. This was like tailored specifically to my interests. It is a bisexual heroine who has blood magic powers, which she has to hide from the Roman inspired uh, aristocracy because people with blood magic in this society are forcibly assigned a spirit guardian so who's attached to them and controls them so that they cannot use their magic to challenge the ruling classes. Well, she gets caught trying to save her girlfriend from an accident, and she ends up in the palace, and a lot of this is kind of prisoner in the palace gilded cage narrative, which is very fun, very heavy on the political intrigue. There's a hot warrior princess, there's a hot warrior ghost man, there's polyamory, and there's an Aroace character, and there are genderqueer characters, and the outfits are all amazing. It's a very death-obsessed society, and so there's a lot of like flowers and skulls kind of decoration. The mood is very aesthetically pleasing. It's a really fun dark fantasy. I would highly recommend this. I mean, if I say blood magic, flowers, and skulls, and you're already perking up your ears, this is for you. Okay, I think this is the only middle grade read, aside from Tea Dragon Society, of this time period. But this is an author I've been meaning to pick up for a while, and I was really happy I did. That's Mary Downing Hahn. She is a middle grade horror writer. She's very popular in the area where I work, so I work a lot with kids' books, so she's been on my list for a while. I chose this one just because it had the most interesting premise to me personally. Guessed, a Changeling Tale. A little girl's watching her baby brother when she accidentally praises him, and the Fae take him away and replace him with a changeling. So she ends up going on a journey through the woods with the changeling in order to try and find her brother and exchange them. But of course, on the way, she develops a relationship with the changeling, who becomes a kind of second brother to her. It's very creepy. It really makes good use of the dark, haunt your nightmares, haunt the margins kind of phase stories of old times. It's loosely set in maybe 19th century Ireland. I don't think it's ever made particularly clear. So it's got a kind of historical vibe to it, too, that really works. You forget when you get older that the historical books you read as a kid really have more of a historical flavor than you remember them having, that they were more challenging than you remember them being, and this is a good example of that. I think this kind of thing is really good for kids. And it was really good for me. I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm going to read more of her books. Maybe all of them? I mean, if the others are this good, definitely all of them. Her works are also starting to be adapted into graphic novels for young readers, so I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot more of her. I read the first volume of Dementia 21 by Shintaro Kago. I was, clicking around something about Junji Ito on the internet, and I saw Kago mentioned as well. Saw some pictures from his work and thought he looked really interesting, a very surreal kind of style. So I picked this up. It's beautiful to look at. Like, look at this shelf candy. Amazing. But this is a manga about a young home health aide who goes to the homes of elderly people to take care of them and encounters a variety of bizarre, surreal, horrifying situations in these elderly people's homes. It's very finger on the pulse of cultural anxiety without being too self aware about it. I thought that the author had a certain diffidence and a certain sort of ghoulish joy in just depicting bizarre images that really made it not too sententious. It was a pretty fun read. It had flaws, and it's not really a linear narrative, it's very episodic, so go into it expecting that, and if you just go into it expecting weird, episodic fun with a slight side dish of cultural commentary, that's where it really shines, I think. I've bought volume 2 and I do plan to read it soon. Okay. Quick interlude from all of these good or middling reviews to talk about a book I really, really hated. That's The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. He's also the author of The Silent Patient, which people have been telling me for ages to read, and after reading this, I'm really glad that I haven't read it and I don't plan to. So, The Maidens has a premise that sounds awesome, which is that there's a professor who has this kind of campus cult called the Maidens, that the main character's niece is somehow tangentially involved with. And after one of the main character's closest friends is murdered, said niece calls the main character and asks her to come and be her support person on campus. And she kind of starts to investigate the mystery. I'm not usually a huge fan of mystery novels, but the Greek-inspired dark academia vibes that this synopsis promised me, the idea of a classics-based cult, of a male professor abusing his power and this female outsider character trying to challenge that sounded so juicy that I picked it up as soon as it came out, although it took me months to actually sit down and read it. I had been looking forward to it all that time. It had been sitting on my shelf as like a, hey, when you get the chance, you're going to be in for a couple fun days. My aunt was reading it for one of her book clubs, so I said I'd read it with her. And to this book's credit, I did read it fast, but that was mostly rage reading. This falls into the trap that a lot of the worst sensational thrillers fall into, which is that it totally tosses aside all of its interesting and juicy thematic material in order to dig up a twist that you don't see coming. It just forgets about all the interesting parts of its premise and goes with something completely different at the end. And it was infuriating. I hated it so much. I hated the way he teased all of these ideas that could have been a good story and then dropped them just to go, ha, fooled ya. It's mean and juvenile, I think, for an author to do that. I felt like the author was patting himself on the back about his cleverness, all while ignoring his own cleverest ideas because he somehow felt that he was above them. It was a really disappointing read. I did read a synopsis of The Silent Patient because a couple of my friends told me that I would probably like it better, and I have to say, sounds like The Silent Patient does the same thing, and I'm not interested. If you're going to use Greek mythology thematically in your story, use it. There's so much there. Use it. And this man, I mean, he is Greek. So he can read Greek, and I get the sense he has a pretty decent grasp of ancient Greek. He seems the type. So he has the knowledge to do a lot of interesting things that he just doesn't do. Anyway, all of the people who compared this book in advance to The Secret History, you're on my list, because it's your fault that I read this. I read this poetry book that I picked up as an impulse buy, because it's very pretty to look at. The author's Heidi Wong. It's called Turning to Wallpaper, and she does illustrations as well as poems. I didn't realize when I picked it up that it was an internet poet and that she started as a teenager, and this is kind of her first book. Uh, there's a lot in here that I think she could develop into a pretty formidable skill as a poet later on. Um, but there's a lot of the self indulgence that you see in internet poets in this first book. So I think I'd want to wait a couple of releases and read one of her later books down the road and give her another try. Um, but I do like her art style, and I think she uses some interesting imagery and is worth keeping an eye on. It's just that this particular book isn't for me. I'm not the audience. I read an advance copy of Once Upon a Tim by Stuart Gibbs. It's a young reader's humor book about a medieval peasant who is tricked by a vain prince into going on a quest to slay a monster and rescue a princess, wherein the peasant does most of the work while the prince reaps all the rewards. A lot of delightful turning tropes on their head that you would expect in a kids' humor book like this. Um, the illustrations are funny. The narration by the peasant boy is very clear. Like, he's narrating as if he knows who he's talking to and explaining things to modern kids in a really cute way. He's a fun, likable protagonist. The characters are fun. And I have to say, the monster called a Stinks is the cutest thing. It is adorable. Um, so, monster at the end of this book, grade A. Another one I really loved was Sweet and Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley. This is about Tamsin, a witch who has been cursed not to feel love and can now only feel it when she takes other people's love as payment for her witchcraft. And Wren, a girl who wants to solve the mystery of a magical plague in order to save her father from it, and has promised Tamsin to pay her love for her father if they do solve the mystery and save him. Uh, so, there's a magical curse. They're tied together. It's grumpy sunshine. It's a magical quest. There's a magical plague. These are all tropes I love. And obviously they fall in love. I mean, look at the cover. You can tell. This What I especially loved about this read was that the characters were very distinct and lovable and memorable. Uh, Characterization, I mean, in a story like this, it's everything. And I just really fell in love with the people in this story, especially Tamsin and Wren. It was a good read, and I'm looking forward to her next book, which is coming out in summer. Can't show you this one because it was a digital arc, but it's Dear God, Dear Bones, Dear Yellow by Noor Hindi, a new book of poems. Hindi is a Palestinian American journalist turned poet, and I love this book. I think one of the big strengths of her writing is that she's not afraid to do a lot of formal variation. So there are a lot of different forms in this book. And I think with a book of poems, that can really be an asset because I'm going to be honest, part of it is that a variety of poetic forms is just fun. It has the kind of like box of surprises, the box of presents feeling when you turn the page and you don't quite know what's coming next. But she also uses the formal variation as a way to express the different types of microaggressions and, let's be real, macro aggression, just aggressions that she's faced as a Palestinian in America. And so it's very touching and in some places devastating. There's also a lot of sharp satirical humor, and It's got a variety that makes it feel like a lived experience and really tugs on your empathy. She's a very gifted writer, and I do recommend this book. I also read When the Reckoning Comes by Latanya McQueen, which I can't show you because my mom's reading it right now. Um, you've probably heard the pitch for this one at some point already. It's pretty recent, came out a couple of years ago. It's a plantation wedding that the main character's white childhood friend is having. And the main character, of course, is black. And she is reluctant to attend, but the childhood friend kind of guilt trips her into it. And the plantation is super haunted, and most of the white characters die because you shouldn't have plantation weddings. Um, it's a good book. It's spooky. It's emotional. You know, it's it talks back at historical revisionism. It's a fun read. I do recommend it. I mean, everything about the book is kind of there in its synopsis. You're not going to get any big surprises out of it, but if that sounds like a good story to you, and it did to me, you will get that story. And it is good. Okay, we're getting toward the end here. Um, Don't Bite the Sun by Tanith Lee was a huge surprise to me. I'd heard of Tanith Lee, but I had never read her before. And I feel like somebody should have told me about her, should have told me how much I needed to read her. Because, oh my god, this book was amazing. It's a sort of utopian slash dystopian kind of gray area sci-fi. And I would say that this is the book that people should read instead of Brave New World. It takes place in a society where nothing people do really has any meaningful consequences. Most work is automated, even creative work is mostly done by machines. If you die, you wake up in a vat and are assigned a new body. People change sexes at will and live pretty much indefinitely. Um, the main character is in a period of life that lasts for about 50 to 100 years, where a person is expected to behave like a stereotypical youth, uh, having a lot of sex and dressing fancy and partying and basically doing nothing of import except exploring their own personality and their own pleasure, which in theory sounds great. I mean, kind of ideal in a lot of ways. But this character is slowly coming around to the idea that nothing she does has meaningful consequences, and therefore nothing she does really has meaning, and the elements of the society that are less than perfect come to light as the story goes on. Um, it's a lot of fun, it's very wacky. It's a wacky hijinks meets existential novel kind of thing. Um, there, I would say the biggest flaw is a certain type of gender essentialism. For example, while characters often change sexes, the only sexes available are male and female. When a character is male, they usually sleep with female characters and vice versa. So, for a book that you would think would include a lot of queerness, it's actually very gender essentialist and heteronormative. Um, there is one character who expresses something like bi or pansexuality, but he's kind of framed as the weirdo, the odd one out. So that is a bit of a problem. I'll see if this improves at all in the sequel, which I've just started. It's called Drinking Sapphire Wine, and I do look forward to that. But yeah, so it's of its time. There's some '70s weird gender stuff in there, but there's a lot about this that's very expansive and touching, and the language is interesting. It's super worth reading. So I immediately went out and bought some more Tanith Lee books, which they're mostly out of print, so used bookstore trip, kind of a bonus. Anyway, if you can get a hold of this, read it. I would love to hear what you think. Okay, this next one's an audiobook that I thought would take me months to get through. I have a tendency to listen to nonfiction books while I'm doing this or that. That's fiction in audio format can be a little weird for me sometimes. Takes a certain kind of concentration that I don't always have available. So I like to absorb a lot of my nonfiction as audio content. So this one I thought would take me quite a while, but I actually listened to the whole thing within a month. That's The Dawn of Everything. It's a sort of historical, anthropological, cultural book about questioning our assumptions about early human societies and seeing if they really do have the same parameters that we thought that they did. Basically, they say that one of the major questions anthropologists seem to ask and have for the last couple of centuries is what are the origins of inequality? They trace this concept back to Rousseau in a very interesting introductory chapter that warmed my 18th century studying heart. And they posit that instead, we can say there are three fundamental freedoms in a human society: the freedom to move around, the freedom to disobey orders, and the freedom to rearrange social relationships, none of which we still have in any meaningful way. And so they ask, how did we lose these freedoms? When in human societies have we had them, and in what combinations? How were they practiced? And in short, how did we get stuck where we are? It's a different way of looking at things that therefore creates, again, that kind of expansion of the possibilities you can imagine for human society, which already in this video I've praised as something I really want out of nonfiction. So I thought this was a really worthwhile read. It was absolutely fascinating. And it's kind of a meta history thing, so it's a lot of brief discussions of very different times and places in humanity in order to try and create, well, not so much create a new overarching narrative as question the ones that we already have in place. If you're at all interested in history, especially ancient history, then I think you need to read this book. Wow, it's amazing. Finally, as the Plagued by Visions Vision of the Month for, I think, February, we all read or reread Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. This is a complete collection of her books of short stories. So I thought about buying a standalone copy of The Bloody Chamber because the cover is really pretty, but I couldn't really justify it to myself. So I read the version I had, reread rather. Carter wrote dark fantasy, folkloric, sometimes horror tales in a very third wave feminist vein. The Bloody Chamber, the title story of the book that we read, is a rewrite of Bluebeard. Her stories are a delight. Her prose is very thick and rich, very decadent, and she's so incisive, and she writes her female characters with a power and a straightforwardness about their needs and desires that is really compelling. This is a great reread, and there's something in it that's fresh every time. If you haven't read it, you're probably not watching this video, because if you're watching this video, you're probably in one's book club. But if you haven't read it, do. Her stories are well worth it. She also wrote a ton of novels, none of which I've read yet, so I'll have to put one of those on my roster for next time. Okay, that includes the first seasonal reading wrap-up. Tell me what you think. Was this too much? Too bad, because I'm probably not going back to monthly ones. Those were a lot of work. I hope everybody who is seeing the beginnings of spring where they are is enjoying it. if your weather is different than my weather, then I hope you're finding your own enjoyment in that weather. Uh, all right. I'll see you guys around, and thanks for sticking with me through this. Love to hear what you think about any of these that you might have read.